Doug Ford just handed Mark Carney political advice that could completely change the outcome of the next Canadian election, and he did it behind closed doors. Here is exactly what was said, why it matters, and what it means for every Canadian watching this play out right now. We are right in the middle of something that feels like a political chess match happening in real time. The Globe and Mail dropped a major story this week, citing 3 separate sources who confirmed that Ontario Premier Doug Ford, a Conservative, privately told Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney to call a snap election, not once, multiple times, in person and over the phone. And the most explosive conversation happened at the First Minister's meeting in Ottawa on January 29th, where all 13 premiers sat in a room together with the Prime Minister. Now here is what you need to understand before anything else. Doug Ford is not a Liberal. He has never endorsed the federal Liberals. He ran his own provincial campaign last year on a Team Canada platform, won a 3rd consecutive majority government, and he did it specifically by saying Ontario needed a strong mandate to deal with Donald Trump. Sound familiar? Because that is almost word for word the argument he apparently made to Mark Carney in private. But here is where it gets complicated. Ford was asked directly by reporters whether he gave Carney advice about calling an election. His answer was classic Doug Ford, technically a non-denial denial. He said, and this is a paraphrase, "I do not divulge our conversations, but when you get 13 premiers in a room, politics comes up." And then he smiled. And then he said, "I called my election. I am good." That is as close to a wink as Doug Ford has ever given in public. And then it got better. When a reporter asked Ford whether he had given any advice to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, Ford laughed and said he congratulated him on winning his leadership review, an 87.4% result at a convention in Calgary. Ford's exact words were, "You do not win elections at conventions. You win elections across the country." He said it with a grin. The reporters were laughing. Nobody missed what he meant. So let's set the stage here. Ford is openly, publicly, through the cracks of every answer he gives, signaling that he has no faith in Poilievre, and he is having private conversations with the Liberal Prime Minister about calling an election. Now, is that political betrayal? Is it strategic common sense, or is it something smarter than either of those? Here's what I think, and I want to walk you through it step by step. Ford and Carney have built what can only be described as an unlikely governing partnership over the last year. They appeared together at the Darlington Energy Complex. They met one-on-one multiple times. Ford even says publicly that he does not care about political stripes. He will work with whoever is best for Ontario. But this goes deeper than just a working relationship. Ford won a majority last year by running against Trump and running for Canada. Carney is now 29 percentage points ahead of Poilievre as preferred prime minister in the polls. Those two facts are directly connected. And then this happened. Carney released a new national auto strategy, a $2.3 billion program, hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs on the line, and a plan so carefully put together that even Doug Ford, who initially went ballistic over Chinese EV discussions, is now standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister, calling it a win for Ontario. How did that happen? And what does it tell us about whether there is actually an election coming? Let me explain something that almost nobody in the political press has actually broken down properly. And I think once you understand it, you will understand exactly why Doug Ford went from being furious about this auto plan to being one of its biggest supporters almost overnight. Here's the version that has been circulating in headlines. Canada dropped the EV mandate, brought back a $5,000 rebate, big win for consumers. That is about 15% of the actual story. Here is the real story. Carney announced a 5-year, $2.3 billion EV affordability program. The rebate is up to $5,000 for battery electric vehicles and up to $2,500 for plug-in hybrids. But the rebate comes with specific conditions that most people have not been paying attention to. First, the vehicle has to be priced under $5,000, but only if it is built by a country that Canada has a free trade agreement with. Second, that $5,000 cap does not apply to Canadian-made EVs and hybrids. Those get the full rebate regardless of price. Here's what that actually means in practice, and this is the part that kept me up last night. If you want to buy a $12,000 Tesla made in the United States, no rebate. A Ford Lightning or a Hummer EV at $7,000 or more, no rebate. An EV imported from China where there is no free trade agreement, no rebate. But a vehicle made in Mexico where there is a free trade agreement priced under $5,000, that qualifies. And a vehicle actually manufactured on Canadian soil, no price cap, full rebate, no questions asked. And then this happened. While all of this was being announced, reports surfaced that the U.S. president is actively weighing whether to pull out of the USMCA entirely. If the United States exits that agreement, suddenly there is no free trade deal with America either, which means American-built EVs would also lose rebate eligibility. The economic decisions coming out of Washington right now are essentially creating an incentive structure that punishes US-made cars and rewards Canadian manufacturing, not because Carney designed it as a punishment, but because the conditions Trump is creating are pushing the market in exactly that direction. But that is not even the real story. Canada recently reached a separate agreement with China to allow up to 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market each year at a significantly reduced tariff rate of 6.1% instead of 100%. At least half of those vehicles must be priced under $35,000. The rebate does not apply to Chinese-made cars because there is no free trade agreement. But here is the long game. If a company like BYD, which is already the world's largest EV seller, which already built electric buses for the Toronto Transit Commission at a plant in Newmarket, Ontario, if BYD looks at this market and says there are 49,000 units of demand, the rebate applies if we manufacture here, and the Canadian government is actively offering investment incentives for EV manufacturers. What does BYD do? What we are learning is that BYD's Newmarket plant only closed after Canada imposed those 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Before that, they were building vehicles on Canadian soil. The plant assembled TTC electric buses, then the tariffs went up, demand dried up, and BYD shut the doors. But the buildings are still there. The infrastructure still exists, and now the door is being reopened. Not just slightly, but with a government program specifically designed to reward anyone who manufactures on Canadian soil with unlimited rebate eligibility. This is the part Doug Ford finally understood when Carney walked him through it one-on-one. Ford's initial reaction to Chinese EV discussions was typical Doug, loud, protective of Ontario auto workers, deeply skeptical. But once the details of this program were explained, the math changed. If a Chinese automaker sets up in Ontario and starts building EVs for under $5,000 with full rebate eligibility, that is jobs. That is investment. That is exactly what Ford has been demanding since the moment Trump started threatening Canadian manufacturing. And right now, with U.S. auto tariffs at 25% on non-U.S. content in Canadian-made vehicles, and with traditional American automakers under pressure, Canada needs new manufacturing partners. The strategy is not buy Chinese EVs. The strategy is give anyone with the capacity to build affordable EVs a reason to build them here. Now, here is something that should be making a lot of people in conservative circles very uncomfortable right now. The official conservative response to Carney's auto strategy was to call it insulting. Their shadow ministers released a statement saying the rebate would help American EV producers. They specifically mentioned the Jeep Compass, which they said should have been built in Canada. And they are not wrong that there are legitimate questions about how the rebate structure plays out in practice. But here is the strategic problem. The Conservatives are currently blocking 6 separate pieces of legislation in the House that deal with bail reform, sentencing for extortion, and organized crime. At the same time that Pierre Poilievre is positioning himself as the party of law and public safety, his own party is the reason those bills are not passing. Carney used the word obstruction in question period, and he used it deliberately. Sources are now confirming that the government has been using that word strategically, methodically, because it sets up a very specific political narrative. The Conservatives are blocking progress. The minority parliament cannot function, and Canadians need to decide. But here is where it gets complicated. Carney has publicly said he is not planning to call a snap election. His office repeated that multiple times this week, and yet Elections Canada has reportedly ordered 700,000 poll tally sheets. Conservatives are accelerating their nomination processes. MPs across the country are reportedly scouting campaign office space. All the infrastructure of an election campaign is being quietly assembled even while the official message is no election planned. The betting markets tell a similar story. The probability of a Canadian federal election being called before June 30th jumped from roughly 8% in mid-January to over 40%. That is not noise. That is a signal. And here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. The last federal election was on April 28th, 2025. That was less than 10 months ago. Calling another election within a year would require Carney to make a credible public case for why it is necessary. And that case is being built right now, piece by piece, through every question period exchange where the word obstruction is used. Now, here is the part that changes the whole picture. Doug Ford called his own provincial election early last year. He said Ontario needed a majority government to face Trump with a unified front. He won decisively, and now he is having private conversations with the Liberal Prime Minister, telling him the country needs the stability of a majority mandate. Ford's numbers are still strong provincially. His political judgment on majority mandates has been proven correct, and he has absolutely nothing to gain from a federal Conservative victory that would put Pierre Poilievre in a stronger negotiating position against Ontario's interests. Think about that. Ford's interests align more closely with a Carney majority, a Liberal he can actually work with, than with a Poilievre government that might pull federal resources away from Ontario and pursue a political agenda that directly conflicts with Ford's own track record in office. The two men are now, by all accounts, genuine political allies, not because they share ideology, because they share a threat. And that threat is economic instability driven by Washington. Here is what nobody is saying at a loud enough volume. Carney holds a 29-point lead over Poilievre as preferred prime minister. The Liberals lead the Conservatives by 4 to 9 percentage points in national polling. Those are not close numbers. Those are the numbers of a party that believes it can win a majority and is calculating whether now is the best time to try. The auto strategy was the first piece of the puzzle. The obstruction narrative is the second. Ford's private endorsement of the idea is the third. And Elections Canada preparing materials is the fourth. But here is the question none of this answers yet. I have laid out the evidence. I have walked you through the auto strategy, the backroom conversations, the political math, and the obstruction narrative being built brick by brick inside the House of Commons. Now, let me give you my honest read on where this is all going. And I want to be upfront about where I am confident and where I am genuinely still working it out. Here's what I think is actually happening inside the Carney government right now. Carney is not a career politician. He was a central banker for over a decade, Bank of Canada, then Bank of England. He spent his professional life thinking in terms of risk management, probability, and strategic positioning under uncertainty. That mindset does not disappear when you walk into Rideau Cottage. And the fundamental structural problem he faces as prime minister is this. He has a minority government. He is 2 seats shy of a majority. Every single major piece of legislation he wants to pass depends on opposition cooperation or abstention. And the Conservatives have demonstrated repeatedly and deliberately that their political interest lies in making this government look paralyzed and ineffective. But here's where it gets complicated. The Conservatives are playing a double game right now, and it is becoming increasingly visible. On one hand, Poilievre's team has made overtures about cooperation on bail reform, on crime legislation, on economic bills. On the other hand, sources confirm that 6 separate pieces of legislation dealing with precisely those issues are currently being delayed in the House. The government's use of the word obstruction in question period is not accidental. It is being used with surgical precision. Every time a Conservative MP stands up and demands tougher action on crime, Carney's team fires back with, "Your party is blocking the 6 bills that would do exactly that." It is a political trap, and Poilievre walked into it. Now, here is something that changes the whole picture. The auto strategy was designed from the ground up to be politically bulletproof. Get Doug Ford on board, get the auto sector unions on board, get Tier 1 and Tier 2 manufacturers on board, Get environmentalists at least partially on board. Announce it at an auto parts plant in Woodbridge, Ontario, right in the heart of the industrial corridor that decides elections in this country. That is not an accident. That is not just optics. That is a government actively constructing the narrative of a future election campaign. We built a strategy. We brought Team Canada together. We protected 500,000 jobs, and the other guys called it insulting. I keep coming back to the timing of all of this. The auto strategy dropped on February 5th. The Globe and Mail story about Ford privately urging Carney to call an election dropped days later. Elections Canada is reportedly sitting on hundreds of thousands of poll tally sheets. Conservatives are quietly accelerating their nomination processes across key ridings. MPs are reportedly scouting campaign office space. None of these things happen in isolation. All of them happening at the same time is a signal. And here is what nobody is saying loudly enough. Carney's personal polling numbers are extraordinary for this moment in Canadian political history. He is running 29 points ahead of Poilievre as preferred Prime Minister. The Liberals hold a lead of between 4 and 9 percentage points in National Party support across every major polling firm. Those are majority government numbers. Not guaranteed, nothing in a first past the post system ever is. But those are the kinds of numbers that make party strategists lean back in their chairs and start doing riding-level math very carefully. The last federal election was April 28, 2025, less than 10 months ago. That is a real constraint. Calling a snap election within a year of the last one carries a political cost. It looks opportunistic. It gives the opposition a clean line of attack. They just had an election. They are wasting your money because the polls look good. This is about power, not principle. Carney's team knows that, which is why the obstruction narrative is so important. The only credible justification for going back to voters this quickly is to say the minority parliament is broken, that the government cannot govern effectively, and that the country needs the stability of a clear mandate, especially while navigating the most aggressive trade war in modern Canadian history. This is the part that kept me up last night. Doug Ford's template is sitting right there for Carney to use. Ford called his early Ontario election by framing it entirely around the external threat. He did not say, "I want more power." He said Ontario needs a unified, stable government to fight Trump. He made the American threat the reason for the election, not political ambition, but national necessity. And it worked. He won a third consecutive majority. The voters rewarded him for the framing. Carney could run that exact same play at the federal level, and he would be running it from a position of strength, with a popular auto strategy just announced, with Ford publicly standing beside him, with Poilievre's numbers in the basement, and with a daily news cycle dominated by Trump's economic aggression against Canada. The narrative writes itself. But here is where I am genuinely uncertain, and I want to be honest about this. Calling a snap election does not guarantee a majority. Canada's electoral geography is complicated. The Liberals came close last April, but fell short precisely because they could not break through in key suburban Ontario ridings, the 905 belt, the communities just outside Toronto where Ford's provincial machine is strongest. Now, interestingly, Ford's implicit endorsement of Carney, his refusal to endorse Poilievre, his public contempt delivered through that "you do not win elections at conventions" line, could move votes in exactly those ridings. Ford's provincial coalition and Carney's federal coalition overlap significantly in that geography, but nothing is guaranteed. Poilievre is a skilled campaigner. His base is energized, and if he can successfully reframe a snap election as liberal arrogance, they just had an election and now they are doing it again because the polls look good, he might be able to close some of that gap. The conservative ground game in rural Canada and Western Canada remains formidable. What I think the Carney team is actually calculating right now is not whether to call an election. I think they are calculating when. A spring 2026 window, meaning the next couple of months, has certain advantages. The Trump tariff situation is front and center. The auto strategy is fresh. Carney's personal numbers are at their peak. But a spring election also means less time to build the obstruction case to a point where it fully resonates with voters who are not paying close attention. A fall 2026 window gives more time and more legislative failures to point to, more opportunities to build the narrative. but it also gives Poilievre more time to recover, rebrand, and close the polling gap. Political fortunes shift. The Trump situation could de-escalate. Carney's numbers could soften. The auto strategy could run into implementation problems. Time is not always the government's friend. Here is what the data tells us, and I think this is actually the most underreported part of this whole story. Polymarket, the prediction platform that has had a reasonably strong track record on Canadian political events, had the probability of a federal election being called before June 30th at around 8% in mid-January. By the time Ford's private advice to Carney became public, that number had jumped to over 40%. That is not noise. When a probability quintuples in less than a month, something real is happening underneath the surface. And then there is the Pierre Poilievre question, which I do not think gets discussed with enough honesty. Poilievre won 87.4% at his leadership review in Calgary. That sounds dominant, but the structure of that review matters enormously. It was 2,500 hand-picked conservative members voting in person in Calgary. That is the base. That is his floor. The ceiling, what he can actually do in a general election in suburban Ontario, in the communities where the auto industry employs hundreds of thousands of people, that is a completely different question. And Ford's dismissal of that number, right there in front of reporters with a half smile on his face, tells you everything about how Ontario's most powerful conservative premier sees Poilievre's federal prospects. If Carney calls an election and wins a majority, Poilievre loses a second straight federal election to the Liberals. At that point, it becomes very difficult to see a path where he remains as conservative leader. That is not speculation. That is a reality that conservative strategists are grappling with right now. The stakes of the next election for the Conservative Party's internal politics are enormous. A loss would almost certainly trigger another leadership race. And that dynamic is part of why Ford, who would prefer a federal conservative partner he can actually work with long-term, may privately believe that moving Poilievre out of the picture sooner rather than later is in Ontario's interest. That is the layer underneath the layer underneath the layer of what is actually happening here. So where does this all land for ordinary Canadians watching this unfold? If you are in Ontario, especially in the suburbs, what happens in the next 6 months will directly affect your job security, your cost of living, and the future of the manufacturing sector that tens of thousands of families depend on. The auto strategy is real money. $2.3 billion in consumer incentives, $3 billion in industrial support, $1.5 billion in charging infrastructure. That is not nothing. Whether it works the way Carney says, it will depend enormously on whether the government survives long enough to implement it fully. If you are in Alberta or Saskatchewan, you are watching a federal government that already cut the carbon tax, but is now rolling out a Chinese EV deal and tightening emission standards. Your concerns about energy pipeline policy and Western alienation are still very much on the table, regardless of who wins the next election. And if you are paying attention to what is happening in Washington, you understand that all of this, the auto strategy, the election speculation, the Ford-Carney alliance, is downstream of one fundamental reality. Canada is navigating a trade war with its largest partner, and every political decision being made right now is being made in that shadow. Here is where I am landing after all of it. I do not think the election date is decided. I think the conditions for an election are being deliberately constructed. I think the auto strategy was phase 1 of that construction. I think the obstruction narrative is phase 2. And I think Ford's private conversations with Carney, now public, are phase 3. The signal that even the most prominent conservative premier in the country believes the government needs a stronger mandate. Whether that adds up to a spring election or a fall election or no election at all before 2029, that is the question. And I genuinely do not know the answer. Neither does anyone else who is being honest with you right now. What I do know is this. Canadian politics has not been this genuinely fluid, this genuinely unpredictable in a very long time. The normal rules about left and right, liberal and conservative, federal and provincial, they are all under pressure in ways that do not fit the old template. And that is what makes this moment so worth paying attention to. So I want to hear from you. You have heard everything I laid out. The secret conversations, the auto strategy, the election math, the Poilievre problem, all of it. Does a snap election actually happen? And if it does, what do you think the result looks like? Does Carney get his majority, or does Poilievre surprise everyone?